talking terrorism control orders. Are they a good idea? We're told there are 3,000 terrorists stalking our streets. Should we just leave them there, or should we round them all up and detain them somewhere they can't do any harm? And what about the human rights of those accused of terror offences? Should we be concerned about them, or should we be paying more time and attention to the human rights of the people they want to kill, like those children in Manchester last week? We'll also be looking at how the Conservative and Labour Party leaders performed last night, as well as looking at Prince William, who's been talking about how his mother's death affected him. Finally, we're going to be talking about the Great British Bake Off, which, crime of crimes, is advocating cutting calories. Well, Mary Berry's replacement, Prue Leith, certainly is.
Drive with special guest host Carol Malone on Talk Radio. We'll get you talking.
OK, it's been more than a week since 22 people were killed at Manchester Arena at an Ariana Grande concert. And there's been investigations into how much the police knew about the bomber Salman Abedi before he made his final, devastating decision to kill those 22 people. Word is coming through that they knew enough at least to be suspicious, and people are asking why they didn't do anything sooner, why they didn't do anything to stop him. At the centre of this are the so-called exclusion orders, designed to intercept returning foreign fighters and put them into rehabilitation programmes, while at the same time denying them entry into the UK if they don't agree to take part voluntarily. So, are these measures the right way to go, or are we just making these fighters who could potentially be brought round someone else's problem? On the line now we have Chris Hobbs, a former Met Police Special Branch officer. Hello, Chris. Welcome.
Hi, Carol.
Now, we're talking about these orders. You probably remember that in 2011, Nick Clegg came in and got rid of the tougher terror orders and replaced them with TPIMs, which don't have the kind of powers that these tough ones do. Do you think we should be bringing them back? We should be interning people who are possible terrorists and a danger to this country?
I think it's fraught with peril. I was interested to note that Tariq Ghafoor, a former very senior officer in the Met, came out in favour of these control orders, or even, it seems, going along the lines of internment. But I think we have to be careful because at the end of the day, we don't want to alienate sections of the community that perhaps are not alienated at the moment, or perhaps are teetering on the brink of tipping over to the wrong side. I think what we need to do, to be quite honest, is to bolster the security services still further. They've got 4,000 people in MI5. Now, that's not a huge number. If you look at the fact, and I don't want to beat the police drum, but we've also lost 21,000 police officers. That's really a huge chunk out of our ability to deal with the situation. It's no good the Prime Minister saying, yes, we've thrown X amount of pounds at it. Probably she has. And you also have to look, again, if we look at our borders. I mean, this business about excluding British passport holders for 2 years is absolutely ridiculous. When the Border Force and my ex-colleagues heard about this, they just collapsed in laughter.
Well, why is it wrong to ban them for 2 years if they could be a danger to this country?
Well, let's look at it. For a start, we're talking about British passport holders.
Yeah. Well, we have British terrorists.
We do.
Salman Abedi was British raised.
Yes, but you can't. What you can't do. Let's take a couple of scenarios. Let's look at, say, somebody gets on the plane in Turkey, pings our system over here, which it would do if he's known, if he's on the radar, and not all of them are on the radar, but let's say. So what do we do then? Do we turn around to the Turkish authorities and say, right, there's a British passport holder on the plane. We want you to take him off the plane and ask him whether he's willing to submit to the various constraints that we're going to put to him. And they speak to him and he says, no, I'm not doing that. So are we then telling the Turks or the French or the Belgians, well, you're going to have this potential terrorist who's a British passport holder wandering around Turkey, France, Belgium, wherever, for a couple of years until we take him back? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Okay, let me talk. You touched on it earlier, and I want to talk about these internment orders. I want to talk about the terror orders, but the idea of interning people. We've been told by the security service there are 3,000 people possibly wandering our streets, and possibly up to 23,000 who might have the capacity to kill. Now, what is wrong? Tariq Ghafoor, you mentioned him. He was the head of the Met Police when the 7/7 bombing happened. He is saying, why can't we detain these 3,000 people who might actually be planning, as we speak, to do what Salman Abedi did in Manchester last week?
I think it's a question of balance, really, isn't it? As I just said, I think if we did that, as happened, of course, in Northern Ireland, if we
it's not comparable, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's not comparable.
Well, I think it is, because you're talking about making maybe 3,000 people martyrs. You're talking about alienating the very people, especially the younger people, who we want to get on side. I'm not saying it perhaps wouldn't be effective.
We haven't got them on side, Chris. They're not on side. 3,000 of them are not on side. And I don't know whether you've read this piece by Tariq Gafoor. What he's basically saying, he's not talking about internment camps like there were in Northern Ireland. He's talking about the kind of place where you take young Muslims who have been radicalised, and in cooperation with Muslim leaders, with imams, with counter-terrorism agencies, you actually try and talk them down from this. You try and de-radicalise them. Now, to me, that makes more sense than just letting them walk the streets where the only thing that they're contacting, the only people they have contact with, are fellow extremists.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm aware he wants to get the Muslim community or sections of it on side. I suspect, in all honesty, in theory, that sounds a good idea, and to a certain extent is what the Prevent programme is all about. But, of course, you're not actually rounding them up and putting them in secure accommodation, which presumably is what he would want. And I think that's where the problem... And, of course, there's been no expression from Muslim community leaders that I've seen saying, oh, yes, this is a wizzo idea, let's do it.
Bottom line is, we can't just do what the Muslim community wants to do, because they are absolutely at risk from terrorism, just like the rest of us. But, I think if you went out into the streets today and said to people, there are 3,000 people that might blow you up next week, the week after, whenever, people would say, round them up. We can't put the human rights of would-be terrorists before the rights of innocent people, surely.
I think, I have a certain sympathy with that argument. I mean, without a doubt, the fact that there are so many people wandering about is disturbing, and the fact that any one of them could launch some sort of attack is extremely worrying. I'm not sure that all 3,000 are potentially terrorists. The problem we've got is monitoring them and keeping an eye on them and putting the ones we want to put under surveillance. And
let me just interrupt you there, because you know as well as I do, you've worked in counter-terror, you know that there aren't enough people in your organisation or in the security services to do that. I read a staggering fact last week. It takes 20 highly trained operatives to monitor one suspect round the clock. And there's only 50 can ever be monitored at any one time. Now, that's... The security services and yourself, you can't deal with that.
Well, you can't with the way the figures are at the moment. This is hypothetical, but if you opened the box and restored those 21,000 police officers back onto duty, as it were, you could, if you used all those for surveillance, you'd be able to monitor another 700 and it's more like 30, in fact, for 24-hour surveillance. You could monitor another 700 of these 3,000 potential terrorists. And not only that, you would also be able to gather, hopefully, sufficient evidence not just to monitor them, but also to prosecute them, as probably would have happened with Abedi had he been put under under surveillance. But
you would agree last week was a game changer. The way we do things has to change now. And surely if that means rounding up people who could do what Abedi did, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
I think it's a risk. I think it is a huge risk, because at the end of the day, it could even result in serious public order problems on our streets. If you suddenly, you look at some of the riots that we've had in the past in towns with strong Asian communities, and if you suddenly had door knocks, early morning raids, people being dragged off, there is a risk. And I say no more than this. There is a risk of causing serious public order problems, which, it must be said, the police would struggle to deal with now more than they did in 2011, because we've lost so many people. So I would much prefer to see more community policing, which has died a death in many towns. Because of the cuts, we've lost the ability to communicate, and we've seen the reaction of communities, haven't we? Yeah. With the surge of police officers out onto the streets, which can't be sustained, but it shows the feeling and the appreciation that all communities really have for the police. Again, there is a danger that by going down this road, in fact, arresting, detaining 3,000 people, which the police would have to do, again, that goodwill could be totally lost amongst some of the communities. It is a risk. I'm not sure at the moment it's one worth taking, but what we need are those 21,000 cops back, and what we need is an increase in security service personnel and possibly stronger legislation. For God's sake, let's strengthen our borders, because they should never have got out there in the first place, those that have travelled. And Theresa May sat on her hands. As we remember the three girls from East London who went out. They just walked onto a plane and went to Turkey. There was nothing to stop them. Why didn't Theresa May post British police officers to Turkish airports when she saw the trickle becoming a flood? I worked at Jamaican airports with Jamaican police. She should have done the same. She should have put in proper departure controls to stop them leaving, to check people. And she did none of that. She sat on her hands, and now we're reaping the whirlwind. There's 3,000 people perhaps on this anxious list, as it were. There are probably hundreds of others we don't even know about who've been over, who've come back because our borders have been so appallingly managed over the last few years.
Chris Hobbs, I can tell you're very passionate about this, but we're going to have to say thank you. But thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it. On the line now is Nikita Malik. She's the Senior Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Nikita, hello, welcome.
Thank you.
You have concerns about these exclusion orders, do you?
Well, my only concern is that the exclusion orders they enable the governments to have existing powers, and I think they should be able to apply these powers, and I think they should be able to use them, because I was listening in before I came on, and I do very much agree with some of the things that you've said. One of the statistics that I was looking at earlier is one of the alternatives to TPIMs, which is terrorism prevention and investigation measures, is covert surveillance operations. And if we have police operating around the clock undercover to have a look at these suspects, that costs us £500,000 a year. Yeah. So what concerns me is not just the lack of funding we've had, is the alternatives, which would involve even more funding on the part of the state, which I don't know if we are even able to give, considering the cuts that we've had to police and the numbers that we're looking at here of people under surveillance.
So would you be in favour of these internment camps? I think Tariq Gafoor, he calls them detention centres. But, would you be in favour of rounding people up? That we have evidence, good evidence, that they are working against the state. Would you be in favour of rounding them up and putting them somewhere where they can maybe be de-radicalised?
Well, I think there are two things we need to look at here. Is if there's proof, then yes, I would agree that we have to use the powers we have in order to survey and in order to appropriately work with individuals who present a threat to our country. I think that's very important. But what concerns me here is just the level of numbers here, which aren't adding up. This is a short-term solution. Yes, they are a security threat, but as you indicated in the interview previously, these numbers may not actually be accurate. It is my impression that there are far more people who are potentially a threat, not for violent extremism, but even for non-violent extremism, because these individuals operate in networks. So they never operate alone. They know people. They are radicalized. They have, many individuals who are working here. So we have to engage with communities. We have to engage with those people in order to de-radicalize them. Now, unfortunately, the Channel program, the Prevent program, and part of the NHS mental health program that individuals are referred to is voluntary in nature, and that simply isn't enough. Voluntary in nature implies that you can opt out of it and continue with your daily life. But if these individuals present an extreme threat to us, there has to be more in place in order to engage with them and in order to encourage them not to use violence in the way that they have in the past.
Nikita, do you think that we have been a bit too soft? Not wanting to offend the Muslim community, do you think we've actually put ourselves in more danger by not saying what needs to be said and not doing what needs to be done? We keep on hearing we mustn't upset the Muslim community. Well, if that's where the terrorists are coming from, surely that's exactly what we have to do. We have to address these concerns and deal with them. And it doesn't matter if we upset or offend people, does it? Not when people's lives are at stake. Not when they're killing. Not when the terrorists are killing our kids.
I think this is one of the most frustrating things, this generalization of the Muslim community, when in fact Muslims are the ones who are actually affected the most by attacks. And I'm not just saying this out of nowhere. We have huge amounts of intra-Muslim violence.
Yes.
And this occurs not just abroad in the Middle East, it also occurs in the UK. We have blasphemy issues. We have issues of Muslims being killed for becoming ex-Muslims. And of course, this is a massive issue. And most importantly, when a Muslim such as Salman Abedi commits an attack like this, the levels of anti-Muslim crime that happen in the UK peak, and it's usually women who wear a hijab or who are very overtly Muslim who are affected the most, often who have absolutely nothing to do with violence. And so I think, yes, I agree with you that communities, not just the Muslim community actually, because Muslims don't live in isolation. They live with other individuals, their teachers, their nurses, their people in the community, religious leaders. Everyone has a duty, has a civic responsibility to contribute, particularly when policing forces are being cut the way they are, but also more importantly that police are overworked and police and intelligence services simply cannot do as much as we hope that they can. So there's a civic responsibility, and if I may add, there's also a responsibility for the private sector to be monitoring this kind of hate material and taking it off so that it doesn't influence young people.
Totally agree with you. Nikita, we have to go. Time constraints, I'm sorry, but thank you for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it. Okay, time for a break now.
Across the UK, online and on